Please join me in welcoming our Vatican insiders, David Gibson and John Thavis, who will be joined by Austen. David Gibson is an award-winning religion journalist, author, and filmmaker. He got his start in journalism in Rome in the 1980s, where he worked first for an English language daily and then for the English program at Vatican Radio, which was run by the Jesuits. David will joke that the Jesuits now sort of run the whole church, thanks to the election of Pope Francis. After returning to the U.S. In 1990, David worked for newspapers in the New York area and wrote for various magazines, and he has also co-wrote and co-produced documentaries for both CNN and the History Channel. He is an author of 2 books on the church, in addition to his latest, Finding Jesus, Faith, Fact, and Forgery, that is the basis of a CNN series of the same name, and David is currently a national reporter for Religion News Service and specializing in coverage of the Vatican. Thank you, David. He is joined by John Thavis, an award-winning journalist and author of The Vatican Diaries, a New York Times best-selling book about the inner workings of the Vatican. John was Rome bureau chief for Catholic News Service until 2012, covering the Vatican for more than 30 years, and traveled with Popes John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI to more than 60 countries. He is past president of the Association of International Journalists accredited to the Vatican, and in 2007, the Catholic Press Association awarded him the St. Francis de Sales Award, the highest honor given by the Catholic press. He divides his time between Minnesota and Rome. Please join me in welcoming our Vatican insiders.
Thank you all. It's great to be here with so many friends and colleagues for this great day. I'm going to take the liberty of being kind of the both moderator / panelist on this at this event, on this session. Hopefully not too much slashing. I'm going to, I think because we've heard enough from Austen Ivereigh for the moment, we'll give him a chance to take a breather, maybe learn to develop an American accent a little more. And so let's hear first a few reflections from John Thavis, who incidentally is, I consider, my rabbi in terms of being introduced to both journalism and Catholic journalism. When I went to Rome in the mid-1980s, John was already well ensconced there and is a real pro and a terrific guy. So we're going to let John deliver a few reflections, and then I think I've got a few thoughts I wanted to throw out there as well, and then flip it over to Austen again, and then I want to leave a good half an hour for Q&A from you folks. We've got a big papal visit coming up, and any questions both about the mechanics of a visit and also the bigger ideas and the bigger themes of the visit are all welcome. John?
Thank you, David. I'm just going to make a few general remarks about covering Pope Francis, and then maybe a couple of things about covering papal trips. There are at least 50 good reasons why Pope Francis is a great story for journalists. And don't worry, I'm not going to list all 50. I'll list 5 because 5 is the magic number for journalists nowadays, right? Exactly. Okay, here are five reasons why the Pope is a great story for the media. His election was a surprise, and as a bonus, the first pope from the global south. Number 2, he came in as a reformer. He had a mandate to reform, he had a plan, he's shown the political savvy to carry it out. Number 3, he has visibly changed the papacy. In other words, he's devised his own way of being pope and changed some of the visible traditions that have gone along with pope. And we all know what those are. Number 4, he's a great communicator. As Austen said, he's the kind of person who not only speaks his mind, but he speaks it in a way that reaches people directly. And that, by the way, has successfully evaded the Roman Curia editors who have traditionally felt it's their job to edit the Pope. I mean, I've actually seen Roman Curia officials scurrying down to the newsstand to buy a newspaper to read the Pope's latest interview. That's how they're getting a lot of the information these days. And number 4 and 5, and a sure sign that he's a great newsmaker, is he has resistance, including internal resistance. all of these things, all of these ingredients make him a fascinating figure for the world's media. And I think, by and large, the media does a pretty good job covering the Pope. Many of you may disagree. I think they do a pretty fair job. However, I think there is a tendency to over-focus on elements of conflict, make the story exclusively one of old versus new, change versus tradition, civil war in the Vatican. It's easy to sell a story if it's civil war in the Vatican. I think these are all partial elements to the story. They're not the whole story. I think we need to remember something Austen mentioned, which is that this Pope's fundamental aim is to revitalize the Church's mission. And in his view, this mission involves a permanent dialogue between the gospel and society, solidarity with the poor and the voiceless, a church that shows mercy to everyone. That is his core agenda. It's not one that easily translates into sound bites and headlines. We're much more likely to be reading about tensions in the church caused by his new approach. We're much more likely to read about irresolvable conflicts. Are they irresolvable? Might they break the church? My point here is simply that what makes this Pope such a great story for the media is not necessarily what makes him a great leader for the Catholic Church. The temptation for the media, and I mean mainstream media and social media here, is to see Pope Francis in strictly political terms and to see what's happening in the Vatican strictly in terms of winners and losers. You know, the old guard or the reformers, Cardinal Pell or his critics, Cardinal Mueller or the German bishops, the Vatican or the nuns, Pope Francis or Pope Benedict proxies. This temptation, I would say, also affects Catholics. From my vantage point, which is now one of shuttling between St. Paul, Minnesota, and Rome several times a year, I see a disconnect between what Pope Francis is doing and the faith lives of ordinary Catholics. I think so far, at least, the average Catholic is largely a spectator in this story. And again, if people disagree, I'd love to hear why. I think average Catholics are interested, but in a passive kind of way, which makes me wonder about the long-term effects of Pope Francis's reforms. Austen spoke of true reform as the center opening to the periphery, and that is true. I also think there's another dimension, which I call the push-pull dimension. I think any successful deep reform has a push and a pull dimension. Clearly, we see the push coming from Pope Francis, well articulated, and the people who are helping him. What I don't see as much is the pull factor. People willing at the diocesan and parish levels to take these ideas and run with them. Bishops and priests, I think many of them are disoriented by this new approach and are watching and waiting to see what happens. And I think people in the pews, to a large degree, are doing the same. Maybe the mechanisms for participation are not well understood. Maybe they're not very effective. And one example of this could be this upcoming synod, phase 2 of the Synod of Bishops this fall. We all know the Vatican has engaged in an unprecedented effort to make a worldwide consultation among Catholics. Having seen the 46-question questionnaire, even as a so-called professional Catholic, I was rather discouraged by the wording to filling it out. I wonder how many Catholics really have. So in short, I think many Catholics are cheering Pope Francis, but at the same time they're asking the question that Cardinal George asked a few months before he died: what does he want us to do? And I'm hoping we get a clearer answer to that during his trip this fall, his trip to the United States. I'm not sure that's going to happen because I can already see a temptation to take whatever the Pope says and does and put the winner or loser paradigm on it. I think we've seen this in in the run-up to his encyclical on ecology, again, trying to squeeze Pope Francis into journalistic models of political conflict. The question is, can the Pope break through in a deeper way when he actually comes here? I think he can. I've covered papal trips for 30 years. I've seen it happen. I've seen popes come into their own on foreign visits. They've commanded people's attention. They've received a hearing they otherwise had not received. Pope Benedict, for example, in the United States and in UK, I think really turned things around. From a two-dimensional figure, he became a three-dimensional figure. And if he didn't change everyone's mind, he at least got a fair hearing. I've been asked to offer a few words of advice since I have such a long experience covering papal trips. I thought of a couple of very minor things. For those covering this trip this fall, number one, I would say, is put aside your expectations while you're covering the trip. Listen and watch carefully to what actually happens. I think journalists tend to pre-write papal trips, at least in their minds, and create a narrative and then plug in papal quotes and other things into that narrative. It's much more interesting to see what actually develops on the ground. Set aside the preconceptions. And the second thing is that every journalist is going to have to make a choice. How do I cover a papal trip? Do I cover it up close? Am I with the Pope? Am I at the event? Or do I cover it from afar in a press center watching him on TV? This is a dilemma that all of us have faced over the years, including those of us who were privileged to fly on the Pope's plane. Even people on the Volo Papale have to figure, am I going to invest all this time and maybe not even see the Pope all that much and be there, or am I going to actually be able to watch him and write my story and file my story? I can tell you from experience that being there is not always the best course to take, and I'll end with just a couple of anecdotes. I can remember in Syria in 2001, we were with John Paul II. He was visiting a mosque in Damascus, and I always made it a point to sign up for every pool I could get on. I felt, listen, Catholic News Service is paying big bucks to put me there. I better be next to the Pope. Well, I was on a select pool, and they bussed us to the mosque about an hour before the Pope arrived. And we got off the bus, about 12 of us, and we saw immediately there was a bad sign. They had a bleacher set up outside the mosque with a sign that said, "Press Pool." And the question was, would we get inside? Well, after some negotiations by our Vatican minder, who returned out of the mosque with a bloody nose, he claimed a door was accidentally slammed in his face. The answer clearly was no, we were not going to get inside. I was with Jim Bitterman of CNN, and I said, Jim, we have no TV monitor here. We have no cell phone coverage. We are going to be the only people on earth who are not going to see this, and we're in the pool. So Jim and I did what we often had to do, which was bending the rules, but we snuck away. We walked around the corner, and we found a little dry goods store on the ground floor of a Syrian apartment building, and walked in, and the owner, Mohammed, was watching TV. I think it was a Syrian soap opera. Jim asked him to switch to the state channel, and sure enough, there was the inside of the mosque. They were going to carry the visit live. Jim ordered up an ice cream sandwich and said, "Can I use your phone to call my CNN office in London?" Mohammed was graciously agreed, and Jim had his office call him back. So we ate ice cream sandwiches and watched the Pope in the little dry goods store. Jim was giving color commentary from a black and white television, but still pretty good. And, signed off as, "This is Jim Bitterman with the Pope in Damascus." And, it was generically true. Now, you might think that would never happen in a country like the United States, but you would be wrong. in 2008 when Pope Benedict came here. I was on a pool, very select pool again, that was helicoptered from JFK to Lower Manhattan and then taken by a bus which had a police escort up the vacated Roosevelt, what's it called, the FDR, the main highway that runs up to the UN. And the police escorts dropped us off and sped off. They peeled away, and there we were. But instead of walking into the UN building with our press badges, we were stopped by New York's finest, the city cops, who said, "You aren't getting in here. We have no authorization." We ended up hiking about at least half a mile, and it was a hot day, to the other side of the UN building, where the UN people also told us, "You aren't getting in here. We have no authorization." We were the select papal pool. At that point, Jim Bitterman was not there, but Andreas English was, and we slipped off, and we snuck in. We followed it. We got in with a pack of UN staffers who walked in, and we walked in unchecked, made our way up to the top floor, and walked into the balcony of the UN General Assembly just as the Pope began his talk. The people outside never saw it. So those are my words of wisdom. I have other words of wisdom about covering papal trips, but corner me at the reception, and I'll be happy to share them.
And be sure and buy John's book, The Vatican Diaries, which is full of anecdotes and great stories about covering the Pope up close and personal for 30 years. Terrific stuff. Also, just in time for the papal visit, John's next book will be out, The Vatican Prophecies. He goes all Nostradamus on us and tells us everything that's going to happen. It's a book on investigating supernatural signs, apparitions, and miracles in the modern age. I haven't read it. I know it's going to be great. So that'll be out September 15th, and it's sure to be another great one. I was only on the papal flight a handful of times. But the other problem with it is it can be one of the most perilous journeys you've ever taken. I think one of the scariest experiences I ever had on a flight was in southern Africa. It was at 1988, I think it was. And the Pope, he was going to 4 countries, and it's 5 countries in 10 days. It's one of those, back in the days with John Paul II, if it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium kind of pilgrimages. And we were the whole point of the thing, that was back in the days of apartheid, is that he wasn't going to go to South Africa itself. He was going to go to Botswana, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Mozambique, and Lesotho, which is embedded, is surrounded, a little mountain kingdom surrounded by South Africa. And it turned out Lesotho has a very rudimentary airport down in the basin surrounded by mountains, and his planes are guided in by 3 radio beacons, 2 of which I think were out. And there was 1 radio beacon and cloud cover down to about 100 feet or something like that. So the plane had to dip down this Zimbabwe Air bush pilot, kind of doing a 727 down there. And John describes it quite well in his book. But 3 times we tried to make that thing and pull up at the last second before we slammed into the mountains, and didn't succeed. So we flew to Johannesburg? Joburg, yeah. Diplomatic incident, one of the biggest diplomatic incidents in the world at the time. The Pope forced to land in apartheid South Africa. An incredible story. We're on the papal plane. We have the biggest story in the world. And they finally, first they wouldn't let us off the plane. Of course, all the Italians start smoking, and and then Mandio has a stroke, one of the Italians, and he's laid out there. The papal doctor comes down to take care of him. They finally decide they need to let us off the plane. We have this great story. We run into the waiting area. There's this bank of pay telephones. This is before cell phones. Bank of pay telephones. All of us, not necessarily in great shape journalists, run to get the first telephone to get this news out to the world. Pick it up. This is how I remember it. Pick up the phone and realize none of us has a Krugerrand to be able to dial because we weren't expecting to come to South Africa. Anyway, enough of that. John's got more of that in his book, and it's a great one. Just a couple of things, observations I think I'd like to make about specifically Pope Francis's upcoming visit to the United States, and kind of in the context of my own experience. Again, as I say, I started in my journalism career and in covering the Catholic Church, really at Vatican Radio, which I'm very thankful for. I was a Protestant back then. Became a Catholic after having worked at the Vatican, which should be a supernatural sign, I think. A miracle of the first order. But back then, when I was working back there, you know, it was a time there was genuine conflict between the Vatican and the American bishops. And it was a real big story and a real genuine problem. Americans were coming over. Because in that time, you had a dynamic where you had a pope who was seen as a more quote-unquote conservative pope, trying to pull the U.S. bishops in a certain direction, and the U.S. bishops kind of resisting and saying, well, we've done things, this is the way we've kind of always done things, and we want to continue doing them this way. And, you know, fast forward now, 30 years, or 30, 40 years, and you've got a pope with a certain degree of unease in the American hierarchy, who, as both John and Austen have said, is trying to push or pull the bishops in a certain direction, and some of them are going along with it, and some of them are not, and some of them are asking, you know, what's going on. So I think, you know, I think there will be some storylines, as John said, storylines of conflict, which are often legitimate storylines. There are tensions going on there. This pope is not afraid of those. He's been very clear about them. Speak frankly, get it up and out, and people are doing that. But it's also important, which we tend to do in the media, not all of you, but me, to think that this is the first time this has happened, and that this is unique, and this is a dynamic where you've got all these American bishops resisting the Pope. No, it's happened before, and the tables have been turned in terms of, you know, which direction is being pulled and which direction is being pushed. So I think that's something, kind of an important thing to remember. And of course now, the other thing, you've got that sort of conservative, liberal narrative clash category going on, being portrayed out there. And you genuinely do have a lot of what we might call conservative types who are upset with the Pope. And of course, you know, it's also important in coverage, and I'm saying this more to secular media than Catholic media, you know, to qualify what sort of conservatives are you talking about. Are you talking about sort of political conservatives who don't like what the Pope says about economics? Are you talking about doctrinal conservatives who are concerned about what the Pope is saying about changes, possible changes in pastoral practices? Or are you talking about liturgical conservatives who are a whole separate, I think, category, who are upset, of course, that we have a Jesuit Pope with a very frayed cassock, you know, and who's, you know, not quite the liturgical traditionalist that they would like. But again, you know, you see there is a genuine upset there, but I think it's real important to stress that the Pope is not taking the side, another side. He's not taking the side of liberals or / progressives. To my mind, what he's simply doing is leveling the playing field. I think you've had some groups who've had kind of, you know, John Paul was Pope for, between John Paul and Benedict XVI, they were Pope for 35 years. That's a long time. I truly remember, because, you know, I wasn't Catholic when I went over to work at the Vatican and in the mid-1980s, and you know, John Paul was the only Pope I'd ever known. He's the only Pope a lot of us had ever known. And when, in 2005, I was there in St. Peter's Square, and Joseph Ratzinger was elected, not only was I feeling foolish because I hadn't predicted that, but when he walked out, honestly, my first reaction when Benedict Ratzinger walked out on the balcony of St. Peter's Square, my first reaction was, what on earth is he doing wearing John Paul's clothes? Because John Paul was the Pope, you know, and I think, you know, having Benedict resigning after 8 years, I think, was really truly a remarkable thing and very salutary for the church. And Francis has said he doesn't expect to have, terribly long papacy. And so, the prospect of changing popes more frequently is not such a bad thing. You realize it's about the office and not about the person. That said, again, under John Paul and Benedict, certain groups, I think, had a certain kind of in, and especially as John Paul grew older, they got a even more of an inside track in the Vatican. That's not the case anymore. But it's not that Francis is favoring one side or the other. It's simply that there's a level playing field. No one's going to get favored in this papacy the way they had been, perhaps, or had felt they had been. So I think there is a certain resentment that stems from that. I also think another important, papal trips are different as well. And again, just to remember, papal trips, put this in the bigger context, popes are different, papal trips are different, and this has happened before, yet it's also still very new. You have to realize the original pilgrim pope, was Pope Paul VI, and I think that gets overlooked quite a bit. And I think also Pope Francis's affinity for Pope Paul VI as a real model is also something that's important to highlight. But it was Pope Paul VI who came to New York for the first time and addressed the United Nations. John Paul II came, in his first couple trips were a great novelty, and you had him coming here and boosting the Catholic Church here, unifying it as trying to, as Austen said. And then the last of his 5, I guess, main trips that were here were really kind of celebrating his legacy and celebrating what he had done. And then even, I think Pope Benedict's 2008 visit to the United States was much like that trip to England that Benedict made, where it was a real success. Benedict didn't have the greatest PR, he didn't have the greatest press, he didn't have the greatest poll numbers, but when he came here and people saw him up close, I think it was a real kind of transformation in perception. But John Paul and Benedict came to an American church that I think is really very different than the church that Pope Francis is coming to. This isn't just about the Pope, it's not just about the Vatican, it's about the church in the United States. And you all, I'm sure, have been reading those Pew Forum poll figures that came out yesterday and talked about the decline in the practice of the faith. There's a lot of tough news out there, especially about the millennials and the younger Catholics. What kind of a church will Pope Francis find when he comes here? It's a church that people aren't taking for granted. Religion is out, spirituality is in. There's, in a sense, these numbers show us that there's a need to start from scratch. And I think in many respects, thanks perhaps to the Holy Spirit, Pope Francis is the best pope for that kind a church, a Catholicism that is starting over, that is not just relying on kind of a bricks and mortar legacy, that people will just naturally be baptized in the church, confirmed in the church, married in the church, and buried in the church. That is going away in many respects. And Pope Francis is somebody who, in a real profound way, welcomes that, and he connects with people, and he really wants the church to kind of go out and to be a new kind of a new kind of mission, as Austen has been pointing out. How successful will that be? That's going to be, I think, the great question. Another great question. Big question, I think, to look forward towards the trip, which John touched on, is how will he make this trip his own? Here's the Pope of the peripheries. And he's going to Washington, to the White House, to speak to a joint session of Congress. A very big thing. No pope has ever done that before. He's going to canonize Junipero Serra at the Basilica. He's going to New York. Here to New York, he's going to the United Nations, he's going to go to Philadelphia. It's a very kind of East Coast power centers trip. You saw that logo that they released for the visit yesterday or this week, and it's Pope looking towards America, and it's all a big kind of jagged skyline of skyscrapers. What is he going to do that's going to surprise us, or that's going to, really mark this as a signature Pope Francis trip? Look at his health. Look at his endurance. How will he do? I mean, he's remarkable. He mangia lavoro, as they say in the Vatican. He eats work, but he's 78. He's now added on this 3-day stopover in Cuba, which is fascinating. He would have loved to have come to the United States over the Mexican border, but instead he's coming from Cuba, which sends a similar powerful message. But it's going to be a long trip, and we're going to be at the tail end of that. And then right after that, he goes back and he has a 3 or 4 week synod where he's got to wrangle all those bishops. That's going to be an adventure too, so look at that. There's one question I just wanted to ask as I flip this over to Austen, and that's about how well the Pope really knows the United States. But one first question I'd put to all of you is, how well do you know Spanish? I think that's also one of the key things. You might want to get a Rosetta Stone course online or something before this comes, because again, his English is not great, and he tends to go off text. And when if you know Italian, you're over there. When he goes off text, it's okay, or if he starts to freelance, it's okay. But you know he's going to do that. And if you're stuck there saying, what did he say? It could be the best line of the day or of the trip, and it'll be in Spanish. So start brushing up your Spanish. But again, what I wanted to put to Austen, because you know so much about, and again, can't recommend his book enough. I blurbed it along with Archbishop Chaput, so we're back on the same page. There's often a debate and some consternation here about Pope Francis. He's never been to the United States. That's a big issue. Many say he doesn't know or understand the United States. When he says some of these very memorable or head-shaking kind of things, comments about capitalism or culture, he doesn't really know what he's talking about in terms of the U.S. context. What is his experience of the United States? What does he know?